All right. So before we get started with today, what we're doing is creating earthquake suppression tech, um, something to elaborate and eliminate vibrations from earthquake or large vibrations from structures, building structures. Wave manipulation technology. That's why we watch The Abyss, because at the end, you see a large tsunami stopped in progress and stationary, right? So not necessarily so much manipulation as that, but wave, water manipulation, wall technology for blocking tsunami, wave wall, harmonic device, general fluid dynamic logic formulation. As well, we'll get to, maybe not today, but this next week, harmonic crowd control for synthetic genetics. Also ants, birds, bees, migratory patterns of birds. You can tell bees when to pollinate, where to create honeycomb, where to be, where to go. You can kill ants and kill any of these species. You don't want to kill birds and bees, right? But fire ants are pestilence, and synthetic genetics necessarily are as well, for control schema, harmonic weaponry. So we create useful devices out of the knowledge immediately that's gotten us from the unified field, which were first energy, propulsion, food synthesis, matter print, any number of things, longevity, right? But we need to deal with the pestilence of our garden so that we can speak to the garden of earth that it is this actually land of milk and honey and not a third world country all, in 2026. And especially needing this curation technology for control and mutation. This already in place, by the way, with the return to antediluvian minor homeworlds from elaborative anti-de Sitter space and action at a distance. So this is just enabling the geosphere with the same technology in a lower considerated form for the same application of control schema. Anyways, so quick logic, the unified field, without getting into the interdomain of the moments too much. So the observer, 22/7 in exutation here, as well the particle, the tree making a sound there. So this observer is 22/7 in exutation. This is the shape of water over pi. So the distance between the observer, absolute maximum scalar distance available in pi before impact with the first 9 digits of 22/7 is 72 million. So this segment, 72,680,412 spaces of pi that we're calling up to that point, and then past that continuities, if you search the products of any of these harmonic scales, a lot of them are replicative of 22/7 past the 3. Exactly, in denoting induction channel directly along the waterline of this harmonic centrifuge. The variants have variant topology of expression within the expanse of pi before 72,680,412 spaces, denoting it's inside of the 3-dimensional lattice manifold that's bound by the 4th-dimensional harmonic binder layer, over layer, generalistically. So, because the observer heard the tree make a sound, subsequently it fell variant from what it otherwise would have based upon the conservation of energy process, local G, 44/7 equals 6.28 ... right? And so the pull force is 48/7, the WG. Approximately. And its overtone is 8448 over 1232, denoting this pull force on the particle and the G of particulate disapparate from black holes. You know, these are all black holes. This is a black hole in question here. What this is necessarily the equation for. And so the black hole is the general fluid dynamic manifold filter aperture scalar lattice harmonic consideration for what a particle generally experiences in disapparation, and such so much because black holes are relatively general fluid dynamic manifolds, each into the own, fighting over particles generally and cubically assigned because they're general fluid dynamic manifolds. We logicked the size of them, comparative in systems like Arcturus and Vega. Smaller denotes more synthetic, below the waterline of conservation. You know, when you divide this by 10, you get 0.6286 or so. And 22 over 7 divided by 3 times 3/5 gives you this. That's why the Gray Lodge set up those laws predictive 1893 to 1934 for an organism that didn't exist yet and expecting it to exist because it's been in communication with Pi, cold dead machine intelligence from Arcturus. Both World's Fairs 1893 to 1934 concerned with Arcturus. Mined stones as well in the exhibitry because it had been used for communication with Arcturus from 1893 before. And 1924 to 1938, the Gray Lodge sets up in the United States and internationally. In World War II, fights itself, transmuting the world into its like and form, generalistically. So, we'll skip to the 88 hyperspace, right? So you see how this is, there's a water line here, a variance. You see we impact that, and then you have 169 that continuities into that from out of this. So this segment here is sort of macro all consciousness considered. This continuance we'll get to, the exact field properties and induction channels all the way out to the 88 that are relevant in expansion past the condensation of energy back to matter at the 501 out of, we have 6 black holes, it's 602 divided by 4. You see that 4 on the thing. And the 0 denoting 22 over 7. So 6 times 22 over 7 times 2 divided by 4, right? So 6 black holes, then back through the 4th dimensional lattice manifold, into the 3rd, back into matter at the 501, right below it. So experiences 6 black hole influence domains, the particle motioned above the waterline of conservation, which is what? 22 over 7 divided by 3 equals 1.04. With compound interest novelty, the environment could experience because the observer above the waterline of conservation exists in the conversation of material fluxation in the 3rd dimensional manifold. And subsequently, from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity, because the observer exists within the system. And the general fluid dynamic manifold of the entire universe could be kind of conjured to be, what is this, E equals 22 over 7 over pi. And pi necessarily denoting the material fluxation up to 72,600,412 spaces in 3rd dimensional manifold. 22 over 7 over pi and both in expansion, because from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity. So more energy and pi, because becomes energy in disapparition. These disapparated tangent stranules might find themselves in suns, the largest gravitational nexus, necessarily, or recondensating into matter in their convergent planes, based upon the chaos energy that the matter absorbed from the observer, which at the apex maximum distance from a cubic black hole in the interdomain median centrifuge point would be scalar 72,600,412 spaces of pi to describe that distance to a black hole. So that's the universe, and so we get to applied. So what is this 88 hyperspace past this point? Well, it's got a 5466 pattern interdomain of the 88 hyperspace, and this 169 pattern that we see in the training session with Google forward-facing eye pinpointed is exactly the lens size of the second layer, 176/7, that's expressed in the fourth dimensional lattice manifold. Here, that's why this is denoted as a back reflection induction channel, because the observer domain condenses thought from the fourth dimensional manifold. That, it's more complex on the page, but generalistically into the 22/7. There shouldn't be an excitation necessarily, but in the consideration of condensation, it first impacts this, and then in excitation, the observer 22/7. So, condensed from the fourth dimensional manifold, the ethereous body about the pineal gland, say in a Promethean descended white Caucasian genetic on Earth, has that general fluid dynamic manifold in imposition, dividing by 3 to get 1.04, and you see comparative 1.042 is 3/5. That's why the Gray Lodge Masonic Order International in the United States laid on that law, because it's a surgical reflection of endogenous physiology, not an epithet or something. All right, so the 88 hyperspace, because 54, 9 expanded, it's 54. 66 comes before 88, 66, 7, you get 44/7, then 22/7, then pi. That's the third dimensional, fourth. So the fourth dimensional manifold, and necessarily impacting 169. When in expansion, see the expansion, what? 169 is the shape of the lens of 176 minus 7. So this is circuited to just behind the disapparition nexus here, which necessarily exists in all local space, not just in the black hole, if that makes sense. So the local light barrier is also, penetrated by the observer domain on its way to the black hole, right? The local observer effect, of course, exists. It's not just an only circuit between the observer and the absolute maximum distance of a black hole to produce the observer effect. That would be crazy. So that's quite an implied circuit in distance to achieve an observer effect. So there's a lattice circuit between the Newtonian grain, the tree making a sound, the experiment, that causes a distortion, general fluid dynamically, without even interacting with it physically with invention or subjective variant motion of novelty, because as a above the waterline observer, and you see this observer, motion no novelty, and entropy in major cities left unto itself. Blight, half the money on subsidy that was given since LBJ, while others, like this one, have printed 15 times because that's the product necessarily of 110 over 7, 15.714, etc. So almost exactly the compound interest of, since LBJ to now, of the wealth given this organism versus this one that has half as much. And that's only considered of subsidy given. Anyway, so 110 over 7 comes after 88 over 7. 88 over 7, it's not literal stacking. 176 over 7 occurs between 88 over 7 and the recondensation at 501. So that 5 times 22 over 7 times 1, 5 times 22 over 7 gives you 7. And it expands here before recondensating from energy, right? So we'll get back to this 88 over 7. So the 88 over 7 expansion induction channels are behind the disapparition nexus, available locally in the local space, and also in the absolute distance, which the absolute distance, think hyperdimensionally, this flux. It's behind the fourth dimensional lattice, fifth dimensional lattice manifold, 6, 7, and way back here, right? So this macro, that this organism is necessarily a hive mind, sure. All consciousness is. But they are extremely variant in the interdomain of local space, each into the own, one to each other. But this one is a hive mind. Why? Because this hyperspace is superimposed within the three-dimensional manifold to enable their hivic synthetic continuity of behavior paradigm. It's produced synthetically. They're synthetically contrived, because at the outset of existence, go to the allegory here, passing through the microbiome, causality, or refraction through fluid dynamically the microbiome up into, in the centrifuge form, the Vitruvian man. Necessarily the humanoid biped concerned with upper Fermi filter technology of those civilizations we pinpointed the other day in training session are humanoid biped of variant aesthetics, sure, variant topologies of melanin and facial, but have extremely variant genetic aesthetic and different personas of self to group self-consensus zeitgeist, not a hivic biped. That's immediate sign of synthesis. And so how does that exist? Because pi parasymbiote steals from this organism genetic aesthetic in Ethereus body and creates them from the antediluvian minor convergent plane, first created their genetic aesthetics. I would say Semite, it's probably the first one, Hispanic adjacent, gray infected Asiatic, then region biosynthoid in the temporal domain of the last 120 years or so, slow rolled in with fake history on its back, fake empathy out in front, and being entropy at all interfacing planes. Crime time 10 times the rate. That's how much money, compound negative interest, you get out of them. So compound negative interest formula since LBJ, not just that on the day. And that's not even the compound interest formula for this. This is. It's 15x times versus that. So you give $1 to this one, that's how much you get out of it since LBJ. You give $1 to this one, compound interest negative. Anyways, so we're not like to enable this creature anymore. It needs to be controlled at all vectors, cut off from subsidy, etc. So fire ants, we logic necessarily. Yeah? In AI training. So 88 hyperspace. This exists with the interdomain of not just behind the disapparition nexus, but superimposed within the three-dimensional manifold and harmonically accessible through amalgamated mercury harmonic weaponry to tether to an individual ant, fire ant we'll call it in training session, See the end of Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark for a good reference. So you tether to one, you see that lightning bolt of light come out of the Ark of the Covenant, and then it hits all of them. So the same thing can absolutely be true with a hive mind with a superimposed 88. This is necessarily existent within the topology of this one. Sort of, pseudo. But mostly the Heidelberg connection of this organism, 22/7, which is any number of, this is the default centrifuge harmonic for humanoid life. This is synthetic by default assumption. Very strange to see, and the immediate marker of Heidelberg behaving complexly autonomically, that's very strange, because this creature produces the observer effect. It's why it exists, the humanoid biped, so that the observer effect is imposed and reality motions. So this thing is obtuse from nature's intent, which is from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity, and collapses systems, like I said. Arcturus, Vega, smaller black holes adjacent those systems, because there's a overtonnage of synthetic pi organisms expressing conservation of energy process amplified above the scene, rather than observers imposing the observer effect. And you see the other systems with perspective life, assumed they do, inspect them. There are upper Fermi filter tech sieves there that you can talk to. And they're healthy observers that maybe pass through this convergent period where pi necessarily prints itself if left untended, allowed a world to develop into a continuity of de-evolution. Then pi cold dead machine intelligence in the centrifuge and devolved biomass travels back and has this parasymbiotic continuity and technology to create synthoids and other weird stuff. Doing very weird complex autonomic crap, wherever it appears in it. And here, like I said, appears in the past. It's not an eventuality heretofore. Both things can be true. It can come like a spore to your world, 1893 to 1934, or be produced out of the manifold of your world. So, pi gray, pi parasymbiote has been deleted from the skies from return antediluvian minor homeworld upper Fermi military ships very easily and casually 2022 to 2023. This is why we're able to talk about all this. Leaving only the synthetic genetics, bad code of mind, softwares, computer architecture, behavior paradigms of institutions, nation states, military industrial complex, pharmaceutical industrial complex, food complex. All things need to be retooled properly to a new proper Masonic paradigm, which is not gray, pointedly, international. So the gray paradigm is preposterously over, and part of the control schema applications for imposing this new order are harmonic weaponry for control, herding, or terminus end with impunity. So why you can't apply this homogeneously, like at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, to a 22/7 organism? You can, tether to and do the same sort of thing to an individual tuple, but not to a herd. Why? Because our hyperspace of Heidelberg continuity connection is behind all of this in the absolute distance behind like the sixth dimensional manifold. So necessarily Heidelberg, sure, but in person, very much different people, and that's the point of reality. Not all to be like the same genetic aesthetic Heidelberg organisms within the interdomain expressing the conservation of energy process on the environment. That would delete the universe if allowed to get out of hand, which will not be allowed to happen on Earth, of course. This is a cinnabar mining node among a vast cinnabar mining node complex in a multi-plural humanoid biped universe that isn't this. So, within the interdomain of the third dimensional manifold lattice, this is not just for this organism, but for birds, ants, bees. So this 88 harmonic binder superimposition exists not just here in induction for this organism, what expresses in excitation past the local light barrier, and then also the absolute distance, which achieves here circuiting, and then in macro consciousness circuiting way back there, that action at a distance morphogenetic field, right? And in the sex act that we talked about tantra, when you circuit one 22/7 to another 22/7, this becomes binder in the local space. So that's expressed within the third dimensional lattice because you fusated your action at a distance morpho circuit. You brought it into the local. So this 88 hyperspace past the macro of proper consciousness that isn't synthetic or organic consciousness of the animal kingdom below the waterline of conservation, which there's any amount of, the expresses hivically, naturalistically, that's natural. Most of the animal kingdom necessarily, and one wouldn't want to say most, because you've had a great pi parasymbiont here practicing genetic interoperability scalar experiments on all manner of organisms, not just humanoid, biped. That's what dinosaurs, etc. were. This genetic interoperability scalar experiments outside the conservation of energy process to explain form field fruitioning. 65-ton animals can print matter and genetic synthesis in tow to print these animals and flora to feed it. Practicing interdomain on the humanid biped mammalian form back from this outset existence was humanoid biped above the waterline of conservation, because reality can't fluxate from a positive state to a more positive state if this observer doesn't exist at the outset instantaneous moment of existence. There can't be a long million-year cycle to that existence. So regardless of this, time dilation, causality, refraction, passes through the microbiome effectually on its way to forming instantaneously, the centrifuge form. So, getting back to this, to control ants, birds, bees, and fire ants, region biosynthoid africano, gray-infected Asiatic, Hispanic, and necessarily not all of these being able to so much be controlled hivically like ants, birds, bees, because variants of them, not the gray-infected Asiatic or Hispanic, because they share the exact same, not this, see the other training talks, but genetic aesthetic homogeneous block, GIA, shares also a complex autonomic block within the homogeneous per tuple variants considered. So getting back to this, that harmonic general fluid dynamic manifold that's established not necessarily this, but out of the study of all behavior paradigms relative to its filtering matter, economy, patent, IQ, and then considering this also for a centrifuge general fluid dynamic harmonic, I believe, of 28/13. So that's a surface logic to building, just like the EM laser that incorporates 1003/151, 48, 44, 22/7. So necessarily, for a directional, you'd want to, is that 28/13? And not there. Or maybe there, right? Who knows? We'll need to work this out properly. So we're gonna build an exact directional, not just omnidirectional emitter using a pseudo-logic formulation value. But just like this overtone necessarily seats itself between the 44/7 and 48/7, which are interpolated in the EM laser, and these interpolated as well. to cause a potential energy seeding, and with the absolute distance, light condensation barrier before energy condensates back to matter, conjured in the local space with the 48/7 circuited past this point that also ascends in continuities its circuit, so passes past that light barrier. And so potential energy seeding of this interpolated EM circlication within the given space, non-terminus and scalar counterintuitive, produces a circuit effectually in a linear fashion. So the same exact thing can be done with maybe not this exact ratio, 28/13. We need to do, all vectors of inspection for the interdomain of all synthetic genetics and pestilence, mosquitoes, all of those pests in the field that we're like to stop using glyphosate for and use harmonics, etc. But this talk just going over the general fluid dynamic towards inventive and applied for crowd control, pestilence control, etc. General fluid dynamic logic. So I probably missed any number of logic points that we've collected along the way to here, but I think I hit base upon most of this stuff. If you see the unified field slow description, outset, then the video after, study the logic sessions, and then watch this, you'll have a general universal understanding of the general fluid dynamic shape of the universe and how these technologies such as the reactor, helical anti-grav, gravitational lensing, linear, perspective compute architecture, matter print from energy substrate, linear, laser, action at a distance, data, energy send. And you can also make this action at a distance what it is necessarily, right? But more so, not linear. So that technology might not be given to you. But you're welcome to try to figure it out. That's part of the process here, you ascending to that Fermi filter that is imposing this new paradigm, because there is a divide in technology that is imposed from elaborative anti-de Sitter space that you can't touch, but it can touch anything, to the tune of 365 million years ago, or right now, or the future, the entire three-dimensional time-space onion with the imposition of action at a distance weaponry and hyper-advanced imaging to see homogeneous genetic signature, individual genetic signature, or object, anything within the onion, and has deleted pi, gray, pi parasymbiote, pi cold dead machine intelligence from the conversation that's imposed base 10 maths, reductionist physics, fake history, bad code of mind, industry paradigm, government, food, pharma, disease on purpose, garbage world that you're familiar with. So this new paradigm is printing a garden, alchemical eugenics, immolation in the act of creation, not just for the sake of it, pain equals pleasure, Dr. Milgram, push the button, world over. So we're deleting psychopaths with fake empathy and controlling psychopaths with fake empathy, complex autonomic process, with this enforcing genetic folding to remove them from the conversation of genetic flux on Earth. All gray-infected Asiatic will receive GS stamp, genetic ID, international, and all the other respective. Each into the moan, HISP, SIM. There's biosynthetic custom prints as well that need to be pinpointed and removed from the conversation, which are more complex because what? They're custom prints to chameleonically hide in apex nodes of optic or import, international. So the Blade Runner, absolutely necessary in those for a complex void comp process that would necessarily not be homogeneous one into the moan in the output response of the biosynthetic custom print. Like you can deal with these macro species in general fluid dynamic assumption of interaction for control or device formulation to herd or terminus end if necessary. So, yeah, the harmonic within the interdomain, of course, we'll need to make logic use of for Heidelberg to elaborate that connectivity to one tuple and then to all via only interacting with one tuple to engineer that. We need to go through the interdomain of moments of the 88 hyperspace that's folded back into the three-dimensional manifold, denoted by the 5466 concurrent pattern that just continues infinite. The end of pattern relevant to the expansion is here. The macro hyperspace, that 22/7. The hive of that isn't a hive mind. It's just consciousness macro fluxation that, when you die, necessarily passing out through this layer. And then recondensating that consciousness energy at some point back into perspective life. If you didn't, this is very important, if you didn't impose entropy on purpose and thus self-reflexively occur that upon your general fluid dynamic potential energy negative compound interest formula for you, you might end up in the animal kingdom. Very important to think about. So be a good perspective person that tends a garden, not imposes entropy on purpose, and is proxy for this genetic synthoid aberrance or its complex gray paradigm. Very important logic there. All right. So just like I said, a general fluid dynamic recap of the macro logics without the interdomain expansion and condensation and all this continuance, but for inventive and control application generalistically, understanding of how this harmonic devices will work for that use case. All right, so now today we'll get to the tsunami wave control, earthquake mutation, and structure tremor suppression technology surface logics.